These are the second part of the notes for graphing and writing linear transformations. So here we're going to write the following transformations in function notation. So previously you were given equations or things to transform and create a graph with. Now this is the opposite. It's telling you what it wants you to do, and then you have to come up with the transformation equation. All right, so first thing I'm going to do here is, well, let's look at number 1. Shift f of x to the right 5. So anytime I'm transforming f of x, I'm going to have a new equation called g of x. So I'm going to start this off with g of x equals, so I have a new transformation, right? So for example, let me just say this. So you would be given like, hey, here's f of x equals 3x plus 2. They gave you an equation. Then it says, I want you to transform it. G of x equals f of x plus 3. It tells you to do this. Well, it's saying, okay, f of x is 3x plus 2. So you'll graph that. And then it says, now to create a transformation, g of x is going to be f of x plus 3. Well, the plus 3 tells you to shift it up 3. So when you graph it, you know that you're going to take your entire line and shift it up 3. Now this is backwards. This is going to say, hey, I want you to do this. Give me the equation in the function notation that I need so I know what to do. All right, so you want to shift f of x to the right 5. So there's a few choices that we have here. So we have f of x plus 5, f of x minus 5, f of x plus 5 on the outside, and f of x minus 5 on the outside. Okay, so we want it to go to the right 5. I'm going to eliminate these one by one. Okay, I'm going to start off with the bottom. F of x minus 5. Anytime the number is outside the parentheses, that's going to tell me it's going to be up or down. So because this minus 5 is on the outside, it's telling me that I'm going down 5. So this is not what I want. Here, this is f of x plus 5. That 5 is on the outside. It's going to do exactly what I think it will, and it's going to go up 5. It's outside, so it doesn't matter. It's telling me up. So if it's on the outside, it's either up or down. If the 5 is on the inside, it's either left 5 or right 5, depending if it's plus or minus. If I have x plus 5, remember, left and right are the opposite. You're in the house with your x, and your x is telling you to do something, and you're going to do the other thing. So normally when you think of x plus, you're like, oh, if I think of plus, I think of the right, because I'm going to go positive. But you don't listen to your x. So when you run away from your x, you're either running to the left or you're running to the right. So here, I have x plus 5. So you're going to think opposite, and that's not going to be right 5, it's going to be the left 5. And so minus 5 would be to the right 5. Okay? So if I'm going left or right, that's inside my parentheses. So then I have f of x minus 5. Think opposite. All right. Number 2, shift f of x left 2 and down 9. Now this has two different types of transformations, so I'm going to do one at a time. The first thing I'm going to do is shift f of x to the left 2. I'm going to do that first. So that means I'm going to start off with my g of x equals, because that's what I start with, because I'm transforming something, right? I want to shift f of x to the left 2. Well, remember, left and right are on the inside of your parentheses. So then I'm going to have f, and then I have x, and then I have 2. So is this going to be plus 2 or minus 2? Remember, left and right are always opposite of what you really think it is. You might think minus 2, but it's really plus 2. So it's going to be x plus 2. Are we done? No, because we still have one more transformation to do. We need to go down 9. Well, if I'm going to go down, that's going to be outside my parentheses. So I have g of x equals f of x plus 2. And I'm just adding on to this. How do I go down 9? Well, I would go down 9 by subtracting 9 to the outside. And then this is my answer. Okay? So I did the first step in blue, and then I did the second step in red. So I'm just adding on as I go. Because sometimes you might have 3 or 4 transformations you have to do. Okay. Number 3, reflect f of x across the y-axis and shift f of x 1 unit up. All right, so there's 2 transformations going on here. So let's start off with the first one. Reflect f of x across the y-axis. Okay, now reflections are going to be negative signs. Anytime I have a negative sign, that tells me I have a reflection. Okay, now let's start. G of x equals. Now, there are two types of reflections we can have. We can have a reflection over the x-axis or a reflection over the y-axis. So you'll either see negative f of x or f of negative x. You have two types of reflections here. But you're like, well, which one is going to be the one that flips it over the y-axis? Okay, it's always the opposite of what you think. Okay, so do you see how there's a negative in here next to the x? So you're like, oh, that's going to be a negative flip on the x-axis. But that's wrong. This is going to reflect over the y-axis. It's going to be opposite of what you think. So instead of saying it's going to be a flip over the x-axis, it's a flip over the y-axis. Now here, f of x is normally y. So you're thinking, oh, negative y. So flip over the y-axis. But it's the opposite. So this is a reflection over the x-axis. Okay? So if the negative is on the inside next to the x, you have to think opposite and say, oh, reflection over the y-axis. Again, reflections are indicated when you have a negative sign. So if I'm trying to reflect over the y-axis, then I want my negative sign next to my x because it's the opposite of what I would think. If I want to reflect over the x-axis, I would reflect it, or I would put it on the outside by the f. I don't want to erase that. I just need to change the color because everything needs to be green right now because it's my first step. Oh my gosh, come on. Here we go. The next transformation I want to do is I want to shift f of x 1 unit up. Okay, well, if I want to go up or down, that's on the outside of my parentheses. So I have g of x equals f of negative x. I want to shift it up 1 unit. So that's going to be positive 1 on the outside of my equation. All right, moving on to number 4. Triple the slope and y-intercept of f of x. So I want to triple the slope. If I'm asking you to triple something, it means I'm asking you to multiply by 3, right? I want to triple the slope and the y-intercept. So if I'm multiplying something, there's only 2 ways we can multiply. We can either multiply 3f of x or f of 3x. Okay, so there's 2 ways we can see tripling. Now I want to figure out which one of these triples the slope and the y-intercept. Okay, so if you look at these two, what's the difference? Well, one of them, the 3 is on the outside, and one of them, the 3 is on the inside. Well, what do I do? Well, if it's on the inside, you have to think. Slope is usually next to what letter? X, right? So next to the x, so if we have like y equals mx plus b, your slope is right here. Okay? Your slope is right next to that x. Do you see how this 3 is right next to the x? It's only going to affect the slope only, because it's saying, hey, take the 3 and multiply it by the slope. I'm right next to it. So this is only going to multiply slope only because it's right next to it. It's right next to the x. This one says, hey, this 3, I'm going to multiply to every single thing in f of x, all of it. So this is going to multiply to slope and the y-intercept. So in y equals mx plus b, it's going to take the m and multiply it by 3, and it's going to take the b and multiply that by 3. It takes everything and multiplies it by 3. So the 3 on the outside means multiply to everything. The 3 on the inside means only the slope, because slope is right next to the x, so it's just in a small area. If the 3 is on the outside, it's doing every single thing. Well, here, I want to triple the slope and the y-intercept, both. So that means I'm going to have g of x, because that's my transformation, equals 3f of x. If I wanted to triple the slope only, then it would be this guy down here. If I want to triple both, then I'm going to do the top guy. Okay. Number 5, shift f of x down 7, reflect across the x-axis, and make the slope half as steep. All right, so we have lots of transformations going on, so let's do things one at a time. Shift f of x down 7. That's the first thing I'm going to do, shift it down 7. So if I'm shifting it down 7, that's going to be outside my parentheses. So f of x minus 7. Okay? If I put the minus on the inside, I'm saying right 7. So be very careful where you put the minus 7. Up and down are on the outside of the parentheses. Left and right are on the inside of the parentheses. All right. The next thing we want to do is reflect across the x-axis. All right. Again, there's 2 types of reflections, over the y-axis and over the x-axis. Be very careful where you put that negative sign. Negative signs tell me a reflection. So I'm going to give you two scenarios here. You're either going to have negative f of x or f of negative x. I'm trying to reflect across the x-axis. And remember, it's opposite of what you think. So you might think this one because the negative is next to the x, but you have to think opposite. It's negative f of x. So this is going to be negative f of x minus 7. So I'm adding on. Each time I'm doing this, I'm adding on. If I want to reflect it over the y-axis, then the negative is going to be inside my parentheses. All right, and then next, make the slope half as steep. Just the slope. I'm only trying to multiply the slope by a half. So if I'm only trying to multiply the slope only, then my 1/2 is going to go inside, and I'm going to multiply that in there. And that's my final transformation. Now, if you have this, so very similar, but instead of the 1/2 being on the inside, you have it on the outside, you're telling me that you're making the slope and the y-intercept being multiplied by 1/2. But we only want to multiply the slope only. So again, it's just going down to, do you understand how a transformation works, and can you apply it, and do you understand it? All right, so that is it for the second part here. If you have any questions, just please feel free to come in to ask.